Mark Parker stared at his backyard, gripping the edge of his coffee mug as the sun cast its golden morning glow over the dewy grass. His German shepherd, Max, was at it again, furiously digging near the old oak tree, sending chunks of dirt flying in every direction. His backyard had already suffered enough damage from Max's relentless determination, but this time something felt different. The dog wasn't just playing or searching for a bone. He was desperate. "Max, stop that!" Mark called, stepping off the porch. The dog barely flicked an ear in acknowledgement, his paws working furiously at the earth. Mark sighed, setting his mug on the porch railing before striding over. He reached for Max's collar to pull him back, but the dog let out a deep, guttural growl, not of aggression, but of insistence. Mark had owned dogs his whole life. He knew when they were excited, when they were afraid, and when they were trying to tell him something. Max was telling him something now. Mark frowned, dropping to one knee and peering at the ground. His eyes widened. A small metal edge glinted beneath the soil. It looked old, rusted, barely peeking through the dirt. His fingers brushed against it, and as he scraped away more of the soil, his breath caught. It was a small box, about the size of a shoebox, locked tight. "What in the world?" Mark muttered, heart pounding. He stood, brushing dirt off his hands, and looked down at Max. The dog sat now, panting slightly, his brown eyes locked onto Mark's. There was something in that gaze, something expectant. He carried the box onto the porch and grabbed a crowbar from his tool shed. It took a few strong pries before the lock finally gave way with a loud snap. The lid creaked open, and Mark felt a shiver race down his spine. Inside the box were stacks of old letters, some yellowed with time, their edges crumbling slightly. And beneath them, something gleamed. He carefully lifted the bundle of letters and gasped. A small, delicate locket rested at the bottom, its silver frame tarnished, but still beautiful. He flipped it open with trembling fingers. A photograph. A woman, smiling warmly. And next to her, a young girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, her hair in pigtails, her wide eyes full of life. Mark's mind raced. Who were they? Why was this buried here? Max let out a low whine and nudged his hand with his wet nose. Mark swallowed hard, his heart hammering in his chest. He needed answers. The letters. He unfolded the first one carefully, trying not to damage the fragile paper. The ink was faded, the handwriting elegant and neat. "My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, it means I never made it back to you. I wanted you to know that you were my greatest joy, my brightest light in a dark world. I pray that one day you'll find this and know that I never stopped loving you, never stopped hoping we'd have our time together again." Mark's breath hitched. The letter was dated 1953. Who was Emily? And what had happened to the person who wrote this? He looked at Max, who sat silently, his head tilted slightly, as if waiting for Mark to understand. "This was never just about digging, was it, boy?" Mark murmured. Max wagged his tail once, then stood, trotting back to the spot he had been digging. He pawed at the dirt again, whining. Mark's stomach twisted. There was more. His hands felt shaky as he grabbed a shovel and started to dig, deeper this time. He didn't know what he was expecting. Maybe more letters, maybe some forgotten keepsake. But as the minutes passed and the hole deepened, something else appeared beneath the layers of dirt. Something wooden. Something big. His throat went dry. His fingers trembled as he brushed away more of the soil. He knew what he was looking at now. A wooden crate, about 3 feet long. Mark swallowed hard. Whatever was inside, it had been buried for a long time. His grip tightened around the shovel as he worked to loosen the earth around the edges. Finally, he was able to lift the lid. The hinges creaked, dust swirling in the golden morning light. Mark's stomach flipped as he took in what lay before him. A folded American flag. A military jacket, neatly folded, its patches faded with age. And another envelope. This one was sealed, the paper brittle but untouched by time. Mark sat back on his heels, breathing heavily. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his fingers gripping the envelope tightly. He had no idea what he had just uncovered, but he knew one thing for certain. Max had led him to something that had been waiting to be found for decades. His rescued German shepherd had uncovered a long-buried mystery, one that was about to change everything. Mark sat on his porch, staring at the envelope in his hands. The morning air felt heavy, thick with questions he wasn't sure how to answer. Max lay beside him, his warm fur pressing against Mark's leg as if sensing the weight of the moment. He turned the envelope over, his fingers tracing the faded ink. There was no name, no address, just a single word scrawled in the center. Remember. Mark hesitated. He had stumbled onto something far bigger than an old, buried keepsake. The military jacket, the letters, the folded flag. This was someone's life, someone's past. And Max had led him right to it. With a deep breath, he slid a finger beneath the fragile paper, carefully breaking the seal. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. His pulse pounded as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. If this is ever found, please take it to her. She deserves to know the truth. There was no name, no date, just those haunting words. Mark exhaled sharply. Take it to who? He muttered, shaking his head. Max, what have we found? The dog let out a quiet whine, nudging Mark's arm. He needed to figure this out. He needed to know whose story had been buried under his tree for so many years. Setting the letter aside, he picked up the locket again, running his thumb over the worn metal. The woman and little girl in the photograph. They had to be connected to this somehow. Was the man who wrote the letters her husband? Her father? Had he never come home? Mark felt a sudden pull in his chest. He had grown up in this town. He knew its history, its people. If this had been buried for decades, maybe someone still remembered. Maybe someone could help him piece together what had been lost. But where to start? Then it hit him. Miss June. Miss June Crawford had been the town's unofficial historian for as long as Mark could remember. She had lived in Willow Creek for over 80 years and knew everyone, past and present. If anyone could help him, it was her. Grabbing his truck keys, he stood, shoving the letters and locket into a small tin before pocketing it. Max hopped up instantly, tail wagging. Oh, you're coming too, huh? Mark chuckled, shaking his head. All right, come on then. The drive to Miss June's house took only 10 minutes. She lived in a small white cottage on the edge of town, surrounded by an old picket fence. Her yard was filled with bird feeders, and a big orange cat named Pumpkin lounged on the porch railing, watching Mark as he parked. Mark knocked twice, stepping back as the door creaked open. Well now, if it isn't Mark Parker, Miss June said, peering up at him with sharp blue eyes. To what do I owe the pleasure? Mark hesitated before pulling the locket from his pocket. I need your help, Miss June. I found something buried in my yard. I think it belonged to someone from a long time ago." She frowned, reaching for the locket. The moment her eyes landed on the photograph inside, she froze. Her fingers tightened around the metal, and for a long moment, she said nothing. "Miss June?" Mark asked gently. She exhaled, her gaze distant. "Where did you find this?" "In my backyard. Max wouldn't stop digging near the oak tree, and then—" He paused. "There was a box, and letters, and a flag." Miss June's eyes glistened. "Oh my." Mark shifted uneasily. "Do you know who they are?" She nodded slowly. "I do." Her voice was thick with something Mark couldn't quite place. "That little girl in the picture. Her name was Emily Dawson." Mark's breath caught. Emily. The name from the letter. "And the woman?" he asked, Miss June's lips pressed together. "Her mother. Margaret." Mark swallowed. "And the man who wrote the letter?" She sighed, running a hand over the locket as if it were something precious. "That would be William Dawson, Margaret's husband, Emily's father." Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. What happened to him? Miss June's expression turned somber. "He was drafted in 1952. He never came back." Mark frowned. "Never came back? They said he was missing in action." A long silence stretched between them. Missing in action. Mark's mind whirled. If William Dawson had never come home, then why had his letters, his memories, been buried in Mark's yard? Miss June seemed to read his thoughts. Margaret and Emily moved away a year later. Without William, there wasn't much left for them here. Mark felt a lump in his throat. Do they know about this? Miss June's gaze softened. "I don't know, dear. I haven't heard from them in years." Mark exhaled. "I have to find her." Miss June nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "I think that's exactly what you were meant to do." Mark glanced down at Max, who sat patiently beside him. The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, his brown eyes filled with something that almost looked like understanding. Mark straightened. He didn't know how yet, but he was going to track down Emily Dawson. Somehow, some way, he was going to make sure this story wasn't lost to time. And Max? Well, Max had already proven that sometimes a dog's instincts were more than just coincidence. They were fate. Mark spent the evening poring over every detail he had uncovered, sitting at his kitchen table with the letters, the locket, and the carefully refolded flag spread out before him. The name Emily Dawson echoed in his mind. If she was still alive, she had to be in her 70s by now. He pulled out his laptop, tapping his fingers against the table before typing the name into a search bar. Several results came up, but nothing that seemed like a solid lead. The name was too common. He tried narrowing it down. Emily Dawson, Willow Creek, 1953. That led to a few archived newspaper articles, mostly about local events at the time, but no mention of Emily. Max sat at his feet, resting his head on Mark's shoe. Every so often he'd let out a low whine, as if urging Mark to keep going. "I know, buddy," Mark muttered, scratching behind the dog's ear. "I just don't know where to look next." Then he thought of something. If Emily and her mother had left Willow Creek shortly after William was declared missing, there had to be some kind of record of where they went. Property records, maybe? School enrollments? He needed someone who could access old records. And he knew just the person. The next morning, Mark drove to the town hall, parking in the small lot outside the red-bricked building. Inside, the scent of old paper and polished wood filled the air as he made his way to the records office. Sarah Jennings, the town clerk, looked up from her desk, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Well, if it isn't Mark Parker, what brings you here this early?" "I need a favor," he said, setting the locket on the counter. "I'm trying to find someone." Sarah picked up the locket, opening it. Her expression softened as she glanced at the photo inside. "Where did you find this?" Mark hesitated before answering, not wanting to stir up unnecessary rumors. "Buried in my yard. I think it belonged to a family that lived in my house a long time ago." Sarah nodded slowly. "What's the name?" "Emily Dawson. She lived here with her mother, Margaret. Her father, William, went missing in the war." Sarah's brow furrowed as she typed into her computer. "Give me a second." Mark waited as she scrolled through the town's digital archives. Minutes passed before she finally spoke. "Margaret Dawson sold the house in 1954. The buyer was a Mr. and Mrs. Turner." Mark already knew that part. His grandparents had bought the house from the Turners years later. Sarah continued scrolling. "Looks like Margaret and Emily moved to Kansas City." Mark straightened. "Kansas City?" Sarah nodded. "That's where the forwarding address was for the sale of the property, but that was 70 years ago." Mark exhaled. It was something. "Is there any way to track them further?" Sarah shook her head. "Not from here. You'd have to dig through census records, maybe voter registrations." Mark ran a hand through his hair. This was turning into a much bigger task than he had anticipated. But he wasn't about to stop now. "Thanks, Sarah," he said, pocketing the locket. "I appreciate it." Back home, he sat at his computer again, this time searching for public records in Kansas City. He combed through pages of archives, newspaper clippings, anything that might give him a clue about where Emily had gone next. Finally, something stood out. A marriage record. Emily Dawson had married a man named Thomas Reynolds in 1971. Mark felt his pulse quicken. If she had taken her husband's last name, that would explain why she had been harder to track. He searched again, this time under Emily Reynolds. An obituary popped up. Mark's heart sank as he clicked on it, only to exhale in relief a second later. It wasn't for Emily. It was for Thomas. He had passed away 5 years ago. The obituary listed the surviving family members. Emily Reynolds. And an address. Mark stared at the screen. After all this searching, after uncovering something buried for decades, he finally had a real lead. Emily was still alive. And now, he had a way to find her. Max let out a soft bark, wagging his tail. Mark smiled, rubbing the dog's head. "Looks like we've got a road trip ahead of us, buddy." The next morning, Mark packed a small bag, secured Max in the passenger seat, and started the long drive to Kansas City. The highway stretched ahead, endless and open, and as he drove, he thought about what he was about to do. Would Emily even want to know? Would this bring her comfort? Or just open old wounds? But something in his gut told him he had to try. Several hours later, he pulled onto a quiet suburban street, double-checking the address he had scribbled down. The house was modest, with a small front porch and a well-tended garden. He parked, his stomach twisting with nerves. Max whined, nudging his hand. "I know," Mark muttered. "Here goes nothing." He stepped out of the truck, walking up to the front door. For a moment, he hesitated. Then, taking a deep breath, he knocked. Footsteps approached. The door opened. An elderly woman stood there, her silver hair neatly pulled back, her blue eyes sharp and clear. Mark swallowed. "Emily Reynolds?" She studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Yes?" Mark held out the locket. "I think this belongs to you." Emily's gaze dropped to the locket. The moment she saw it, she gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes. "Where did you find this?" she whispered. Mark's throat tightened. "It was buried under an oak tree in my backyard." Emily's eyes flickered with recognition. "That tree!" Her voice trembled. "My father planted that tree before he left." Mark nodded, his grip tightening on the locket. "I found something else too. Letters, a flag, and a note." Emily's breath hitched. "A note?" Mark hesitated before pulling out the envelope he had found in the crate. "It was with the flag. It just said, 'Remember.'" Emily's hands trembled as she reached for it. Her lips quivered as she carefully unfolded the paper inside. Silence hung between them as she read. Then a soft sob. Mark swallowed hard. "I don't know why it was buried, or how it got there, but I thought you should have it." Emily clutched the note to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to me." Max let out a quiet whine and stepped forward, pressing his nose against Emily's hand. She smiled through her tears, stroking the dog's fur. Mark exhaled, a warmth spreading through his chest. He had done what he came to do, but something told him this wasn't the end of the story. Not yet. Mark sat on Emily's porch, watching as she held the locket in her trembling hands. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow across the yard, illuminating the lines on her face. He could see the weight of the years in her eyes, the memories flooding back as she traced her fingers over the delicate metal frame. Max sat patiently at Mark's feet, his ears twitching as he observed the exchange. Every now and then, he would let out a quiet whine, as if sensing the emotion in the air. Emily finally exhaled a long, shuddering breath. "I never thought I'd see this again," she murmured. "I was just a little girl when we left that house. I barely remember what it looked like." She looked up at Mark, eyes filled with something between gratitude and grief. "How did you find all of this?" Mark hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "It wasn't me, really. It was Max. He wouldn't stop digging under that old oak tree. When I finally checked it out, I found the box, the letters, the flag." He nodded toward the note she still held tightly. "And that." Emily's eyes softened as she looked down at Max. "Smart boy," she whispered, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. Max thumped his tail in response. She folded the note carefully, pressing it against her chest for a moment before setting it on the table beside her. "My father, he was always writing letters. Even before he left, he would write little notes for me and my mother. He said words had a way of keeping us together, even when we were apart." Mark shifted in his seat. "Do you remember much about him?" Emily smiled faintly, though there was sadness in it. "Bits and pieces. He was tall, always laughing. He'd lift me onto his shoulders and let me touch the lowest branches of that tree. I remember the way he smelled, like soap and tobacco, and his voice." Her smile faltered. "I used to fall asleep listening to him tell stories, and then one day he was gone, just like that." Mark swallowed. "Did your mom ever talk about him much after you left?" Emily shook her head. "Not really. She tried to be strong for me, but I could see how much it hurt her. Every letter she wrote to the army came back unanswered. We lived in Kansas City for a while, but it never felt like home. She worked hard, but she never stopped waiting. She never remarried." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I think she always believed he would come back." Mark glanced down at the folded flag on the table. I think he wanted you to remember him. That's why he left these behind. Emily nodded, her fingers brushing over the fabric. It means so much to know he thought of us, that he didn't just disappear. It's like a part of him finally came home. Mark watched as she traced the edge of the locket again. I want to know more, she said suddenly. About how it got there. About why it was buried. She looked up at Mark, determination in her gaze. Would you help me find out? Mark hesitated only a second before nodding. Of course. Emily's lips curved into a small smile. Then I suppose we have some work to do. The next morning, they sat at Emily's kitchen table, sorting through the letters Mark had brought. The handwriting was neat. The ink faded, but still legible. Some were addressed to Margaret, others to Emily herself, though she had never seen them before. She held one carefully, reading aloud. My dearest Emily, if I could bottle the sound of your laughter and carry it with me, I would. The nights here are long, and I miss you more than I can say. I dream of the day I come home and see you run through the yard again. Until then, be good for your mother, and always remember how much I love you. Her voice wavered. He wrote this to me, she whispered. But I never got it. Mark frowned, flipping through the stack. It looks like they were never sent. Why? Emily shook her head. I don't know. Unless, her eyes widened. Unless my mother buried them. Mark's brows furrowed. Why would she do that? Emily's gaze grew distant. Maybe she couldn't handle reading them. Maybe it hurt too much, or maybe she didn't want to believe he was gone. If she never read his final words, then maybe, in some way, he was still alive to her. Mark exhaled. That makes sense. Emily carefully gathered the letters, holding them close. I want to find out what happened to him. I want to know if he was really gone, or if there's any chance he survived. Mark hesitated. That's going to be difficult. Military records from that time, especially for soldiers listed as missing, aren't always easy to track down. Emily nodded, but the determination in her face didn't waver. I have to try. Mark thought for a moment before pulling out his phone. I have a friend who works in historical archives. He might be able to help us find something. Emily's eyes lit up. Would you call him? Mark nodded, scrolling through his contacts before tapping a name. Hey Dave, it's Mark Parker. Listen, I need a favor. I'm trying to track down military records from the Korean War, specifically for a soldier named William Dawson. Can you help? A pause. Then, I can try, but that's going to take some digging. Do you have any service numbers or details? Mark looked at Emily, who quickly flipped over one of the letters. Yes, she said, reading off a number. Does that help? Dave whistled on the other end. That's a good start. Give me a couple of days, and I'll see what I can find. Mark thanked him and hung up, looking back at Emily. Now we wait. Emily nodded, gripping his hand briefly. Thank you, Mark. This means everything to me. Mark gave her a reassuring smile. We're going to find the answers, Emily. One way or another. Max let out a soft bark, tail wagging, as if he agreed. The waiting was the hardest part. Mark had always been a man of action, but now he found himself at a standstill. For the next few days, he and Emily went through each letter carefully, reading and rereading William Dawson's words. It was like piecing together a man's life from fragments left behind, each sentence a window into his hopes, fears, and unshaken love for his family. Max stayed close, sensing the intensity of the moment. He would rest his head on Emily's lap as she read, his warm presence grounding her in ways neither she nor Mark fully understood. Then, finally, Mark's phone rang. "Mark, it's Dave. I've got something for you." Mark's stomach tightened as he put the phone on speaker. "What did you find?" Dave exhaled sharply. William Dawson's official military records list him as MIA, missing in action, since 1953, which you already knew. But here's where it gets interesting. There's a declassified report from 1955 indicating that some soldiers believed he had survived. They claimed to have seen him in a North Korean prisoner camp. Emily gasped, clutching Mark's arm. "He was alive?" Dave hesitated. "It's possible. The report suggests that a group of prisoners identified a fellow soldier as Dawson, but by the time the war ended, he was never accounted for. No formal confirmation of his survival was ever made, and as far as the military was concerned, he remained missing." Mark frowned. "So what happened to him?" "That's the problem," Dave admitted. "There's no definitive answer. Either he didn't make it, or if he did, no one ever found him." Emily covered her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. "So he might have been out there all this time?" Mark squeezed her hand gently. "Or maybe he was lost before they could bring him home." Dave's voice softened. "I know this isn't the closure you were hoping for, but there is one more thing. I found a document from the Red Cross. It was a list of names sent from the North Korean government after the war ended, prisoners they claimed had died in captivity. Dawson's name wasn't on it." Emily blinked rapidly, her breath unsteady. "What does that mean?" "It means that officially, the North Koreans never confirmed his death. He simply vanished." Mark's jaw clenched. "There's got to be more out there." Dave hesitated. "There might be. But it's been 70 years, Mark. Records from that time are scattered, incomplete. If Dawson survived past the war, there's almost no telling where he ended up." Emily wiped at her eyes, taking a shaky breath. "Thank you, Dave. This means a lot." After hanging up, Mark turned to Emily, watching the emotions flicker across her face. "Are you okay?" She nodded slowly. "I just don't know what to do with this information. He wasn't dead when they said he was, but now, I don't know if I should grieve or hope." Mark sighed, glancing at the stack of letters on the table. "If we want more answers, we need to go deeper. Maybe there's someone still alive who knew him." Emily wiped her eyes again and straightened. "Then that's what we'll do." Mark admired her strength. Even after all these years, she was still willing to chase the truth. The next morning, they visited the local Veterans Hall. Mark knew a few of the older members, men who had served in Korea or had friends who had. They sat in the back of the room, drinking coffee and sharing stories, their laughter echoing through the walls. Mark and Emily approached an older man with silver hair and sharp blue eyes. "Excuse me," Mark said. "Are you James Carter?" The man nodded. "That's me. What can I do for you?" Emily hesitated before pulling the locket from her pocket, showing him the photo inside. "Do you recognize this man?" James took the locket, squinting at the photograph. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his expression darkened. "Where did you get this?" Mark and Emily exchanged a glance before Mark answered. "It belonged to William Dawson. We're trying to find out what happened to him." James sucked in a slow breath. "I knew Dawson." Emily's eyes widened. "You did?" James nodded. "We trained together before shipping out. He was a good man, always talking about his wife and little girl. He kept a picture of them tucked inside his helmet. We ended up in different units, so I lost track of him. But I remember hearing rumors after the war, stories about captured soldiers. Some people swore they saw him in a prison camp, but no one could prove it. Eventually, his name just faded away. Emily gripped the table. So you think he was alive? James exhaled. I don't know. But I do know that after the war, a lot of guys never made it back. Some of them might have been left behind. Emily's hands trembled. Left behind? James hesitated before nodding. There were rumors that not all the prisoners were returned, that some were either too weak to travel or, well, some might have been kept for other reasons. Emily closed her eyes, her breath uneven. Mark placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. James studied her carefully. You're his daughter, aren't you? Emily nodded. I never got to know him, but I know he loved us. James softened. That he did. He was always writing to you. You were his whole world. Emily wiped at her eyes. Thank you, James. This means everything to me. James hesitated before pulling something from his pocket. It was a small, worn notebook. I don't know if this will help, but I wrote down names after the war, men I remembered hearing about. Dawson's name is in here. You might be able to find more. Mark took the notebook, flipping through the pages. It was old, the ink slightly smudged, but the names were clear. And there, near the bottom of one page, was William Dawson's name, circled. Next to it was another name, Charles Beckett. Mark looked up. Who's Charles Beckett? James rubbed his chin. He was one of the guys who claimed to have seen Dawson after the war, but he disappeared himself not long after. Emily's brow furrowed. Disappeared? James nodded. Some men just faded away, changed their names, moved to different places, didn't want to relive what happened. If Beckett's still alive, he might know something. Mark glanced at Emily. They had another lead. Emily squared her shoulders. Then we find Charles Beckett. James sighed, but smiled. You've got your father's spirit, I'll tell you that. As they left the Veterans Hall, Max trotted beside them, his tail wagging as if sensing their momentum. Mark looked at Emily, who clutched the notebook like a lifeline. You ready for this? Mark asked. Emily nodded. I have to be. Mark gave her a reassuring nod. They weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. The search for Charles Beckett took Mark and Emily deeper into the past than they had expected. His name was a shadow in military archives, appearing in official records from the Korean War, and then disappearing without explanation. Mark spent hours on his laptop, searching through veteran databases, newspaper archives, and old government reports. Emily sat beside him, combing through the worn notebook James Carter had given them, running her fingers over the inked name again and again, as if willing it to bring them closer to the truth. Max lay at their feet, his eyes flicking between them, sensing the intensity of the moment. Finally, Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Found something. Emily straightened. What is it? Mark turned the screen toward her. There was a Charles Beckett who lived in Springfield, Missouri. He died in 1998, but his obituary mentions a son. Matthew Beckett. If he's still alive, he might know something. Emily swallowed. How do we find him? Mark exhaled. We start with the basics. If he still lives in Missouri, we track down his last known address. The search led them to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Springfield. It was late afternoon when they pulled up in front of a modest house with a well-maintained lawn and a small wooden porch. Mark killed the engine and looked over at Emily. You ready for this? Emily gripped the locket in her palm. I have to be. They walked up to the door, Max trotting beside them. Mark knocked twice, stepping back as they waited. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his 60s with graying hair and tired blue eyes. He studied them cautiously. "Can I help you?" Mark cleared his throat. "Are you Matthew Beckett?" The man hesitated before nodding. "Who's asking?" Emily stepped forward, holding up the locket. "My name is Emily Reynolds. My father was William Dawson. I think your father knew him." Matthew's expression shifted, his eyes flicking from Emily to the locket. His face paled slightly. "Dawson? I haven't heard that name in a long time." Emily swallowed. "But you recognize it?" Matthew sighed, stepping aside. "Come in." The house smelled of old books and coffee. Framed photographs lined the walls, a history of Matthew's life captured in still images. He led them into the living room and motioned for them to sit. Max lay at Emily's feet as Matthew settled into a worn armchair. "My father never talked much about the war," Matthew began, rubbing his hands together. "But when he did, there were always certain names that stuck with him. Dawson was one of them." Emily leaned forward. "Do you know what happened to him?" Matthew hesitated before nodding slowly. "I don't know everything, but I do know this. My father believed Dawson survived." Mark's pulse quickened. "How?" Matthew exhaled. "After the war, a few men claimed to have seen American prisoners in remote camps long after the official lists were released. My father was one of them. He swore Dawson was among them." Emily's breath hitched. "But why wouldn't they have been released?" Matthew's gaze darkened. "Because not all of them were meant to come home." Silence stretched between them before Emily spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did your father ever try to find him?" Matthew nodded. "He did, for years. He wrote letters to military officials, traveled to veteran meetings, even tried contacting foreign sources who might have known something. But every time he got close to an answer, doors shut in his face. He started to believe that someone didn't want the truth to come out." Mark clenched his jaw. "Do you have any of those letters? Any documents?" Matthew stood, disappearing down a hallway. A few minutes later, he returned with a small, weathered folder. "This is all I have. My father kept everything he found." He handed it to Emily. "If anyone deserves to see this, it's you." Emily opened the folder carefully. Inside were yellowed letters, scribbled notes, and a single, faded photograph. She inhaled sharply. "This is him." Mark leaned over her shoulder. The photograph was grainy, but unmistakable. A group of prisoners, standing in a muddy clearing, their uniforms tattered. One man stood near the center, staring at the camera. His face was gaunt, his hair longer than regulation, but his eyes, they were unmistakable. It was William Dawson. Emily covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. "He was alive." Matthew sighed. "That photo was taken in 1956, 3 years after he was declared missing." Mark's stomach twisted. "Then what happened to him?" Matthew shook his head. "No one knows. That's the last trace my father ever found. After that, William Dawson vanished again." Emily's hands trembled as she clutched the photo. "So he never stopped fighting to come home?" Matthew's voice softened. "No, he didn't, and my father never stopped fighting for him." Mark exhaled. "Then we pick up where he left off." Matthew studied them both for a long moment before nodding. "If you're serious about this, I might have one last lead for you." Emily wiped at her eyes. "Anything. Please." Matthew stood again, this time walking to a bookshelf and pulling out an old leather-bound journal. Before my father passed, he told me about a man who had seen Dawson in the late 60s. He was living under a different name, trying to disappear. The last known place he was spotted was Anchorage, Alaska. Emily's breath caught. Alaska? Matthew nodded. If Dawson made it out, if he escaped, maybe he didn't want to be found. Maybe he was afraid of what would happen if he was. Mark frowned. Then we need to find out why. Matthew handed them the journal. Then you're going to need this. My father documented everything. If there are answers out there, they're in here. Emily held the journal to her chest, tears slipping down her cheeks. Thank you. Matthew's eyes softened. I hope you find what you're looking for. As they left the house, Mark could feel the weight of the journal in his hands, the pages filled with decades of unanswered questions. Max trotted ahead, glancing back as if urging them forward. Mark looked at Emily. Alaska's a long way from here. Emily met his gaze, determination burning in her eyes. Then we better get moving. Mark nodded. The search wasn't over. Not even close. The drive to the airport was quiet. Emily sat in the passenger seat, flipping through the pages of Matthew Beckett's journal, her fingers running over the aged paper. Mark focused on the road, glancing at her every so often. She was lost in thought, her eyes scanning the notes with the kind of determination that told him she wasn't going to stop until she had answers. Max rested his head on Emily's lap, his tail thumping softly against the seat. He had been their constant companion through this journey, and somehow, Mark felt like the dog understood more than either of them. It's all here, Emily finally murmured. Notes, timelines, letters my father wrote before he was captured, and after. Beckett must have spent decades gathering all of this. She exhaled. It's incredible. Mark nodded. Matthew said the last trace of your father led to Anchorage. If we're going to find anything, it starts there. Emily closed the journal carefully, pressing it against her lap. I still don't understand why he never came home. If he made it out, why didn't he try to find us? Mark hesitated before answering. Maybe he couldn't. Or maybe he thought he had to stay gone. Emily looked out the window, her grip tightening on the journal. Then we find out why. They reached the airport, checked in, and boarded the plane to Alaska. Mark wasn't sure what they would find once they landed, but he knew one thing. Emily was ready. The flight was long, and Emily barely slept. She kept the journal open on her tray table, flipping through it even after the cabin lights dimmed. Mark dozed in and out, but every time he opened his eyes, he saw her, staring at the pages as if willing them to reveal something more. When they landed in Anchorage, the cold air hit them the moment they stepped outside. Emily pulled her coat tighter around her as Max trotted beside them, his breath puffing out in small clouds. Where do we start? She asked. Mark pulled out his phone, checking the address Matthew had written down. There was a man named Henry Dalton. He ran a small supply store back in the 60s, said he met a man who matched your father's description. If he's still alive, he might know something. Emily nodded. Then let's go. The supply store was on the outskirts of town, a small, worn-down building with a faded sign above the door. Mark pushed it open, the bell jingling as they stepped inside. An older man stood behind the counter, adjusting a box of fishing gear. He looked up as they entered, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly. Help you? Mark stepped forward. We're looking for Henry Dalton. The man tilted his head. You found him. Who's asking? Emily hesitated before speaking. We're looking for someone, a man who might have been here a long time ago. His name was William Dawson. Henry froze. His gaze flicked between them before landing on the journal Emily held. "Where did you get that?" Emily tightened her grip on it. "It belonged to a man named Charles Beckett. He was looking for my father for years." Henry exhaled slowly. Beckett. I haven't heard that name in a long time. Mark felt his pulse quicken. "So you remember him?" Henry nodded. "He came here once, must have been the late 70s. Asked me if I'd ever seen Dawson. Told him the same thing I'll tell you." He leaned forward. "I did." Emily sucked in a breath. "You saw my father?" Henry nodded. "He came through here sometime in the late 60s. He wasn't using the name Dawson, though. He was going by Will Harper." Emily's hands shook slightly. "Why?" Henry sighed. "Because he was hiding." Mark's jaw tightened. "Hiding from what?" Henry rubbed his temples. "I don't know the full story, but when I met him, he looked like a man carrying a weight too heavy for one person. He was quiet, kept to himself, always watching over his shoulder. I asked him once why he never left Alaska. And you know what he said?" Emily shook her head. Henry looked at her with a seriousness that made the air in the room feel heavier. He said, "Because the past doesn't forgive, and the truth doesn't let go." Emily swallowed hard. "Did he ever say what he was afraid of?" Henry shook his head. "No. But whatever it was enough to keep him from ever looking back." Mark exhaled. "Do you know what happened to him?" Henry hesitated before nodding. "He left town in 71, said he was heading north. That was the last time I ever saw him." Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "North where?" Henry hesitated. "There was talk about a settlement near the Yukon River. Remote, off the grid. He might have gone there." Emily exchanged a look with Mark. "Then that's where we go next." Henry sighed. "If you're really going after this, you better be careful. The Yukon's not a place you just wander into." Mark nodded. "We'll be prepared." Henry studied them for a moment before reaching under the counter. He pulled out an old, folded piece of paper and slid it toward Emily. "I don't know if this will help, but your father gave me this before he left. Said if anyone ever came looking for him, they'd need it." Emily picked it up, unfolding it carefully. It was a hand-drawn map, rough but detailed, with a small X marked near a bend in the river. Her breath caught. "This is where he went?" Henry nodded. "It's the best lead you've got." Mark exhaled. "Then that's where we're going." Emily looked up at Henry, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "Thank you." Henry nodded. "I hope you find what you're looking for." They left the shop, stepping into the crisp air. Max trotted beside them, his ears perked as if sensing the shift in the journey. Mark looked at Emily. "The Yukon's a long way from here. You sure you're ready for this?" Emily tightened her grip on the map. "I have to be." Mark nodded. "Then let's go find your father." The road north stretched endlessly ahead, the vast Alaskan wilderness growing thicker around them with each passing mile. Emily sat in the passenger seat, gripping the hand-drawn map Henry Dalton had given them, her eyes scanning the faded markings over and over. Mark kept his focus on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, but every so often he stole a glance at Emily, watching the way she clutched the paper as if it might disappear. Max lay curled in the back seat, his ears twitching at the sounds of the world outside. He had been an anchor for both of them throughout this journey, sensing every shift in energy, responding to Emily's emotions before she even spoke. "This isn't just about finding my father anymore," Emily murmured, breaking the silence. It's about understanding why he stayed away. Mark nodded. If he's still out there, we'll find out. They drove for hours before reaching the last marked town on the map. It was barely a town at all, just a small cluster of buildings near the edge of a frozen river, the kind of place where everyone knew each other. They pulled into a small gas station, the only one in sight. Mark shut off the engine, and Max lifted his head, sniffing the cold air that seeped through the cracked window. Inside, an older man stood behind the counter, leaning against the register with a weathered expression. He eyed them carefully as they entered, taking in their heavy coats and Emily's tight grip on the map. "Not many folks come through here," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "You lost?" Mark shook his head. "Looking for someone." The man's gaze flicked to the map. "Seems like a long way to come looking." Emily stepped forward. "We were told there was a settlement north of here, somewhere near the Yukon River." The man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He exhaled through his nose. "Not much up that way except frozen land and old ghosts." Emily held her ground. "Did a man named Will Harper ever pass through here?" The man didn't answer right away. He reached for a pack of cigarettes from behind the counter, tapping one against his palm before looking up at her. "You mean Dawson?" Mark felt Emily tense beside him. "So you do know him?" The man nodded slowly. "He was here. A long time ago." Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "Is he still alive?" The man took his time lighting the cigarette, inhaling deeply before speaking. "If he is, he don't want to be found." Mark stepped forward. "Do you know where he went?" The man studied them carefully. "Why do you care?" Emily swallowed hard. "Because he's my father." The man exhaled slowly, his expression softening just slightly. That man never stopped looking over his shoulder. Whatever he was running from, it was bigger than him, bigger than all of us. Emily's grip tightened on the map. "Please, I just need to know where to look." The man hesitated, then motioned for them to follow him outside. He led them behind the station, where an old snowmobile was parked. "If you're serious about this, you'll need to follow the river north for about 30 miles. There's an old trapper's cabin up there. He used to stay there from time to time." Mark frowned. "How do we know he's still there?" The man took another drag of his cigarette. "You don't, but it's the only lead you've got." Emily nodded. "Then that's where we're going." The man looked at them for a long moment before tossing his cigarette into the snow. "Be careful. This land doesn't forgive mistakes." They gathered their gear, loading up their packs with supplies before setting out. The cold bit at their skin as they moved along the river's frozen edge, Max trotting ahead, his nose low to the ground. Mark kept his eyes on the distant tree line, watching for any signs of movement, but the land was silent, except for the wind howling through the trees. Hours passed. The deeper they went, the more isolated they felt. Emily pressed forward, her breath visible in the frigid air. Mark knew she was running on determination alone, pushing past exhaustion and uncertainty. Finally, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, they spotted it. A small cabin, barely visible through the thick pines. Smoke curled from a chimney, a faint sign of life in the vast emptiness around them. Emily's breath hitched. "Someone's here." Mark reached for her arm. "Let's be careful." They approached slowly, Max leading the way. Mark knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet. Nothing. He knocked again. Then the door creaked open. A man stood there, his face worn by time and weather, his gray hair hanging past his shoulders. His eyes were sharp, wary. He took them in, Emily, Mark, and the dog, his gaze lingering on Emily the longest. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, in a voice rough with age but unmistakable, he whispered, "Emily?" Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Dad?" The man's face crumpled, and his hand gripped the doorframe as if he needed the support. "You shouldn't have come here." Emily took a shaky step forward. "I had to." Mark could see the struggle in William Dawson's eyes, the years of running, the weight of everything he had carried. "How did you find me?" Dawson asked, his voice thick. Emily swallowed hard. "A dog led us to you." Dawson's gaze flickered to Max, who sat quietly beside her, watching him. Something in his expression shifted. "Come inside," he said finally, stepping back. They entered the cabin, the warmth from the fire washing over them. Dawson moved slowly, as if uncertain whether he was dreaming or awake. He turned to Emily, his eyes searching hers. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he whispered. Emily's voice was unsteady. "By leaving us? By letting us believe you were gone?" Dawson exhaled heavily, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand. I was protecting you." Emily's hands curled into fists. "From what?" Dawson looked at Mark, then back at Emily. "From the people who never wanted me to come home." Mark's pulse quickened. "Who were you running from?" Dawson hesitated. "Not everyone who went missing in that war stayed missing by accident. Some of us knew things they didn't want getting out." Emily's hands trembled. "So you let us think you were dead? You let Mom—" Her voice broke. "She never stopped waiting for you." Dawson closed his eyes, his expression pained. "I never stopped waiting for you either." Emily's breath shuddered. "Then why didn't you come back?" Dawson turned to the fire, staring into the flames. "Because coming back would have put you in danger, and I couldn't live with that." Mark exchanged a look with Emily, seeing the storm of emotions in her face. The truth was finally within reach, and it was only the beginning. The fire crackled softly in the cabin, its warmth pushing against the cold that seeped in from the outside. Mark sat quietly in a chair near the door, watching Emily and her father as they faced each other, the weight of decades settling between them. Max lay by Emily's feet, his ears twitching at every shift in tone, every breath that hitched in the air. Emily stared at the man before her, the father she had never truly known. His face was aged, his eyes shadowed by memories she couldn't begin to understand. But there was no mistaking it. This was him. This was William Dawson. "You have to help me understand," Emily said finally, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Why did you let us believe you were dead? Why did you stay away?" Dawson ran a hand over his face, exhaling heavily. "Because coming back would have meant bringing danger to your doorstep." Mark leaned forward. "You said before that some men didn't stay missing by accident. What did you mean?" Dawson's eyes flickered to him, then back to Emily. "After the war, I wasn't just another lost soldier. I was a problem. I knew things I wasn't supposed to know." He paused, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them. "I was taken prisoner in 1953. But it wasn't just the enemy that wanted me silenced. When the war ended, the government exchanged prisoners. Except some of us never made it onto those lists," Emily's fingers tightened into fists. "They left you behind?" Dawson nodded slowly. "They decided some men were too much of a liability, too much of a risk. Those of us who knew about certain classified operations, certain mistakes. Well, they figured it was better if we never came home." He swallowed hard. "I escaped in 1956, made it out of North Korea, and spent 2 years trying to find a way back. But by the time I reached friendly territory, I was already a ghost." Mark's stomach twisted. "They erased you." Dawson nodded grimly. "My name was already listed as MIA, presumed dead. There was no place for me anymore. The men in charge didn't want questions. If I had returned, I would have been forced to keep quiet. Or worse, disappeared for real. So I ran. Changed my name, kept moving." He let out a bitter laugh. "I told myself it was the only way to keep you safe, that if they thought I was gone, they'd leave you and your mother alone." Emily's breath shuddered. "But you never once tried? Never sent a letter? Never let us know you were alive?" Dawson's face crumpled. "I wanted to. I thought about it every day. But every time I got close, I saw shadows watching me. Men who weren't supposed to be there. Even here, in Alaska, I had to keep my head down." His voice cracked. "I couldn't risk you getting caught up in it." Silence filled the cabin, the fire popping softly as if hesitant to break the tension. Emily wiped at her eyes. "Mom never stopped waiting for you. She spent her whole life believing you'd come home." Dawson squeezed his eyes shut. "I never stopped waiting for her either." Emily's hands trembled. "She died believing you were gone." Dawson's shoulders sank. Mark had seen a lot of emotions in his life, but he had never seen regret as raw as the kind that lived in William Dawson's eyes at that moment. "I know I can't fix what I did," Dawson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I can't make up for the life you lost, for the years you spent without a father. But I swear to you, Emily, I loved you every single day I was gone." Emily's chin quivered, and for a moment Mark thought she might break completely. Instead, she took a shaky breath and steadied herself. "I need time to understand all of this." Dawson nodded. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, if ever." Emily looked at him, her emotions swirling too fast to pin down. She wasn't sure if she could ever forgive him, but she wasn't ready to walk away either. Mark cleared his throat. "There's still something I don't understand. You said you were running from people who wanted to keep you quiet. Do you think they're still out there?" Dawson hesitated, his jaw tightening. "They never really go away." Mark frowned. "After all these years?" Dawson gave him a weary look. "When people bury secrets, they don't like them being dug up." Emily's eyes darkened. "But we found you. And if we did, that means someone else could too." Dawson exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Which is why you shouldn't have come." Mark felt a chill crawl up his spine. "You think someone's watching you now?" Dawson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, moving to the window. The vast white landscape stretched out before them, but Mark noticed the way Dawson's eyes scanned the tree line. Then, quietly, Dawson said, "I think they never stopped." Emily stiffened. "What do you mean?" Dawson turned back to them, his face grim. "I saw a man a few days ago. He wasn't from around here, didn't belong. He was watching the cabin from the trees." He exhaled. "I don't know how, but they know I'm still alive." Mark felt his pulse quicken. "Then we need to leave, now." Dawson shook his head. "Running won't help. If they've found me, they'll just follow." Emily's breath was shaky. "Then what do we do?" Dawson looked at her, his expression unreadable. We finish this. We stop running. Mark clenched his fists. How? Dawson's eyes hardened. By making sure the truth they tried to bury finally comes to light. Emily straightened. We have proof. The journal. The letters. The records we found. Dawson nodded. Then we use them. We make sure people know what really happened. Mark exhaled. That's not going to be easy. Dawson gave him a knowing look. Nothing worth doing ever is. Emily wiped at her eyes, squaring her shoulders. If they're coming, then we don't wait for them. We take the fight to them. Dawson studied her for a long moment. Then a small, tired smile formed on his lips. You're just like your mother. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. Then let's make sure this ends the way it should have a long time ago. Mark tightened his grip on the chair's armrest, feeling the weight of what was about to come. Max let out a low growl, his ears perking as he stared toward the window. Mark followed his gaze. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, a shadow moved. Someone was out there, and they weren't alone. The air in the cabin felt thick, every breath heavy with tension. Mark's eyes locked onto the shadow moving beyond the trees, barely visible against the dim light of the late afternoon. Dawson's words echoed in his head. I saw a man watching the cabin from the trees. Now there was no question. They weren't alone. Emily followed his gaze, her body stiffening as she clenched her fists. Max stood at the door, ears perked, letting out a low growl, his body tense. It wasn't just one person. More than one figure shifted beyond the tree line, moving in a calculated, quiet manner, their silhouettes blending into the snow-covered landscape. Mark spoke in a low, steady voice. We need to move. Now. Dawson shook his head. They're not here for a chat. If they've come this far, they're here to make sure I stay buried. His jaw tightened. We don't run. Emily turned toward him. Then what do we do? Her voice was steady, but Mark could hear the tremor beneath it. Dawson moved quickly, grabbing an old canvas bag from beneath the wooden table and dumping its contents onto the surface. A revolver, a hunting knife, and a handful of old maps spilled out. He grabbed the gun, checking the cylinder. 6 rounds. Not much, but enough to make them think twice. Mark felt his pulse quicken. You think they'll try to come in? Dawson looked at him grimly. They've waited this long. They won't leave empty-handed. Emily's hands shook as she reached for the hunting knife, gripping it tight. They don't get what they came for. Dawson's eyes met hers, something close to pride flickering in them. Then we make sure they don't. Outside, the figures stopped moving. Silence settled over the trees, the kind that only came before something bad happened. Then, a single voice cut through the cold air. William Dawson. The voice was steady. Calm. Too calm. Dawson's face darkened. I know that voice. Mark gritted his teeth. Who is it? Dawson exhaled. Someone who should have been dead a long time ago. Emily gripped the knife tighter. What do they want? Dawson's expression was unreadable. To finish what they started. Mark moved toward the window, peering out at the figures. They stood just at the edge of the clearing now, their breath visible in the frigid air. The lead man stepped forward, tall, weathered, dressed in a thick winter coat, his face partially obscured by a scarf, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. He held no weapon in sight, but that meant nothing. The ones who were most dangerous never showed their hand first. Come outside, Dawson. Let's talk like old friends. Dawson let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Friends? That's a hell of a word for what you did. The man sighed. We both know this has been a long time coming. You can't run forever. Dawson looked at Emily, then at Mark. I'm not running. Mark tightened his fists. What's the play here? Dawson exhaled. They expect me to come out alone, but they don't know about you two. He turned to Emily. You trust me? Emily hesitated for half a second before nodding. Yes. Dawson's lips pressed into a tight line. Then listen carefully. Mark, you take Emily and Max out the back. There's a trail behind the cabin that leads toward the river. Take it and get to higher ground. Emily's face twisted in protest. No, I'm not leaving you. Dawson's eyes softened, but his voice was firm. I need you to be safe. You need to take the journal, the letters, everything we found. That's what they don't want getting out. If you have it, they'll have to come after you instead of finishing me off. He met Mark's gaze. Keep her safe. Mark hesitated. And what about you? Dawson's eyes darkened. I'll buy you time. Emily shook her head. No, we stay together. A sharp noise cut through the air, a single gunshot, echoing against the trees. The figures outside didn't move, but the message was clear. Time was up. Dawson grabbed Emily's hand, squeezing it once before pressing the bag with the journal into her arms. Go. Now. Mark grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her toward the back door. Max followed, his body tense, ears perked for any sign of movement. They slipped outside, the cold hitting them instantly. The trail Dawson had mentioned was barely visible beneath the snow, but Mark spotted it, leading away from the cabin and toward the tree line. He gripped Emily's wrist and started forward, moving as quickly as they could without drawing attention. Behind them, they heard Dawson step onto the porch. His voice rang out, steady. You got what you wanted. You found me. The lead man chuckled. Took long enough. Mark didn't stop to listen. He kept pushing forward, his breath heavy in the freezing air. Emily moved beside him, gripping the bag to her chest as if her life depended on it. Because it did. Then, another gunshot. This one closer. Too close. Emily stumbled, but Mark caught her. Don't stop! Max let out a sharp bark. Something was wrong. Mark turned just as movement flickered in the trees beside them. Another man, dressed in dark clothing, stepping out from the shadows, gun raised. Mark barely had time to react before the man spoke. Don't move. Emily froze, her breath hitching. Mark's mind raced. He knew what this was, a trap. Dawson had been right. They were waiting. They had always been waiting. The man stepped forward, his gun steady. Hand it over. Emily clutched the bag tighter. No. The man's eyes darkened. Then you leave me no choice. A low growl filled the air. Max. Before anyone could react, the German shepherd lunged. The man barely had time to pull the trigger before Max slammed into him, knocking him off balance. The gun went off, the shot ringing through the forest, but it missed. Mark didn't hesitate. He surged forward, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting, forcing the gun from his grip. The man let out a grunt, stumbling as Mark shoved him back, sending him crashing into the snow. Max snarled, standing over him, his teeth bared. Mark didn't wait to see if the man would get up. He grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her forward. Run! They sprinted through the trees, the cold air burning in their lungs. Gunshots rang out behind them, but they didn't stop. Emily's grip tightened around the bag. What about my father? Mark didn't answer, because he didn't know. The forest closed in around them as Mark pulled Emily forward, his grip firm despite the freezing air biting at his skin. The sounds of gunfire echoed through the trees, each shot sending ice through his veins. Max ran ahead, his tail stiff, ears pricked forward, leading them through the underbrush as though he knew exactly where they needed to go. Emily gasped for breath beside him, her fingers still clutching the bag against her chest. "We have to go back. We can't leave him." Mark didn't slow. "We don't have a choice. If we go back now, we're dead. And all of this, dies with us." Emily's breath came in short bursts, her steps faltering, but she didn't argue. The truth was bitter, and they both knew it. Dawson had given them a way out, a way to finish what he had started. Turning back now would mean it was all for nothing. The terrain sloped upward, making every step more punishing. The trees grew denser, the cold harsher, but Max never hesitated, his paws kicking up small sprays of snow as he forged ahead. Mark's lungs burned. The gunfire behind them had stopped, but he knew better than to take that as a sign of safety. Then, a noise. A snap of a branch. Too close. Mark spun just in time to see a figure emerging from the trees, their rifle raised. His body moved before his mind did. He tackled Emily to the ground as the gun fired, the bullet missing them by inches. Max snarled, charging straight at the gunman, his speed terrifying. The man barely had time to react before Max leaped, his powerful jaws clamping down on the attacker's arm. A scream tore through the air. The rifle fell into the snow. Mark grabbed Emily's wrist. "Run!" Max released the man, turning on his heels to chase after them. More figures were moving in the trees now, shadows slipping through the snow like predators closing in. Mark's mind raced, searching for options. They needed cover. Somewhere to regroup. Somewhere to hide. Then he saw it. A narrow break in the landscape just ahead. A ridge overlooking a frozen river. It was dangerous, but it was their only chance. "This way!" he shouted, tugging Emily toward the ledge. She didn't hesitate. Together they scrambled forward, the icy ground slick beneath them. Mark didn't slow, didn't dare look back. The moment they reached the edge, he made a decision. "Jump!" Emily's eyes widened. "What? Jump now!" Max leaped first, his body cutting through the air before landing hard in the snowbank below. Mark grabbed Emily's hand and pulled her forward, launching them both over the edge just as more gunfire erupted behind them. The world spun. Cold. Ice. Air knocked from his lungs. The impact was brutal, but they were alive. Mark rolled, gasping, blinking against the snow. Emily landed beside him, the bag still clutched to her chest. Max barked frantically, circling them, urging them to move. Mark forced himself up, his body screaming in protest. The figures at the top of the ridge were staring down at them, their weapons ready. Emily grabbed his arm. "We have to go." Mark nodded, adrenaline forcing his legs to move. They ran, following the river, staying low, every step crunching against the ice-covered surface. Behind them, voices shouted. The chase wasn't over, but they had gained ground. They ran until their lungs burned, until the sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. When they finally stopped, it was only because their bodies refused to go any further. Emily dropped to her knees, gasping. Mark collapsed beside her. Max stood guard, his eyes never leaving the direction they had come from. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They had escaped. But at what cost? Emily turned toward Mark, her voice shaking. "What if he's gone?" Mark looked at her, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. "We finish this. That's what he wanted. That's how we make sure none of this was for nothing." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she nodded. "Then we make sure the world knows the truth." Mark exhaled. He had no idea what came next. But one thing was certain. They were never going to stop running. They were going to fight.